I'm going to say that we are so grateful and thankful that we have our friend, hopefully he's still our friend, my friend, our friend Stephen McAfee with today's message and meditation, After Easter, Then What?
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to suggest that I not talk and they just play some more. You're okay with me. Welcome here. So it's been an interesting sequence. We had Michael and Susan talk about Palm Sunday, and we had Wanda talk about Easter, and here we are now after Easter. And so Easter's like the end, right? It's like the culmination of everything. So now we're done. No what? So Christmas? I don't know. But we're not actually done. So I want to talk to you about something that probably some of you don't know because it's not often taught in Christian traditions. But there are lots and lots of parallels between the life and times and events in Moses' life and those in Yeshua's life, or Jesus' life. And one of them is that the first Passover, which is where the Egyptians had enslaved the Hebrew peoples for over 400 years, so there was literally nobody alive, or had been alive for a long time, that ever remembered not being enslaved. It's a long time of slavery. And so Moses comes along, and God empowers Moses to free those people from Egypt. And they do. And they're led out of Egypt, and they start this journey toward the Promised Land. So they're now a free people. That event that initiated all that was called Passover, because the angel of death passed over all the Hebrew people that night, and not the Egyptian people. And the firstborn of all their animals and all their children died, except for the Hebrew peoples. So that Passover took place. Now, that part's pretty well known. What is less known is that 50 days after that, exactly 50 days after that, another major event occurred. Not just in the life of the Hebrew people who eventually became Jewish, but in the life of the world. World religions changed after this. And it was the first major change in world religion in a long, long, long time. And that was, the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And the new teachings came forward. The word Torah, by the way, which most Christians translate as law, is a mistranslation. It doesn't mean law. There are Hebrew words that do mean law. But this word, Torah, means teachings or instructions. So what was given at Mount Sinai was a set of teachings for the people. And it was given eventually in written form, what's now we call the 5 books of Moses. That event of receiving from God, receiving these Torah or teachings from God on Mount Sinai, took place exactly 50 days after Passover. That interval is 7 weeks. And it's called in Hebrew Shavuot, which is just a Hebrew word that means weeks. Plural of Shavuot, which is Hebrew for week. So back then, starting way back then, and up to now, Jews have what they call counting Omer, which means from the time of Passover, they count 50 days. And then they celebrate the receiving of those teachings that we all got on Mount Sinai at that event. There was another unique part to that event, if you read the scriptures, whether you believe it or not, but the story is that the entire people at Mount Sinai, not just Moses, saw and heard God. All of them. So that's a unique thing in religious history. Usually it's a visionary, not a group of people, especially a huge group of people. So that all happened 50 days afterwards. Now the parallel that you probably got, maybe you didn't know that, but the parallel that I'm pretty sure you don't know is that, so Yeshua comes along later, has his whole ministry, gets arrested, tortured, crucified, died, and resurrected. So that's the story of the Palm Sunday entry into Jerusalem, the Good Friday crucifixion, the Easter resurrection. We all know that story because that's the part of the story that Christianity took. They went, yep, they like this part, and they took that part. What you don't know is what happened 50 days after that. Exactly 50 days after that. Which in the Christian tradition is called Pentecost, which is a Greek word meaning 50 days. So there's not a lot of complexity to this. 50 days after the Passover that Jesus celebrated before he died, the last one he celebrated on earth with his apostles and friends. 50 days after that Passover, all of his family and all of his disciples, 120 people, were gathered together in Jerusalem in what was now called the Upper Room. And you know why they gathered there on that day? Because it was Shavuot. Because they were celebrating receiving the Torah of Moses. Because they were all Jews. Every last one of them. So they were gathered together to celebrate the Shavuot and the weeks that had passed between Passover and the time when the peoples had received these teachings from God. They were celebrating, we received a divine revelation on this day thousands of years ago. Actually about 1300 years ago. And on that day, something else happened. And that's what's called the bestowing of the Holy Spirit on the apostles. And that changed the world also, because it was at that point the teachings of Yeshua went out. It had not gone out to the world. It had gone to a very small group of Jews in Israel. After this experience, which is called Pentecost, 50 days, the apostles were empowered to take the teachings of Yeshua out to the world under his authority and with his power. And they did that. And that also transformed the world. So huge events happening in exactly the same time sequence that had happened before. And we aren't taught that, generally speaking, so we don't know that. So I want to tell you a couple of things that, first of all, this, I'm going to read you part of it so you actually hear the story. This may have been a while since you heard the story. This is from the book of Acts, and it's Acts 2. And it says, when the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot, arrived, they all gathered together in one place. And suddenly there was a noise like a powerful rushing wind from heaven. And it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Now that experience right there is also reported in the experience of Elijah the prophet. It's reported in a number of Eastern writings that are non-Christian, non-Jewish writings, about this powerful wind that comes present in the group. Moving on. And then tongues of fire appeared, like flames of fire. Tongues of fire appeared and distributed themselves, one tongue resting above the head of each apostle. Again, is this a story or was it literal? You know, you have to decide where you stand with all that. But this was an experience they actually had. They weren't making up this story, they were recounting their experience of this tongues of fire after this great inrush of wind. And it rested upon each of them. And when it did, they were empowered to speak on behalf of the Spirit. So, going on, there were many people residing in Jerusalem at that time, men from almost every nation under earth. Why is that? Because it was Passover, and at Passover people came from all over the world at the time to Jerusalem, to the temple. Jews and non-Jews. And when this crowd came together, and the apostles came out of the house and began to teach them, the crowd was astonished. Are not all these men Galileans? Because they all were. They were all from northern Israel, which was Galilee. And they had a different accent. If somebody were from England up here speaking right now, you wouldn't think they were maybe French. You would know they were from England. Yeah? You wouldn't think they were American. You'd know they were from England. Galileans had a distinctive accent. So even the people who didn't know who these men were knew they were from Galilee by the way they talked. Are not these men all Galileans? So how is it that each of us, Greek, Roman, Indian, Jewish, are hearing them speaking in our native language? That's what speaking in tongues actually is.
Yeah.
Not a bunch of gibberish. It's the ability, because of the power of the Holy Spirit, to convey a message to another soul in a way they can hear it. And people empowered with the Holy Spirit today can still do that. Can they do it with languages? I'll tell you a story in a minute. But even if they can't, when you allow that Spirit of God to work through you, you will find a way to reach the soul you're trying to connect with. Because it's not you doing the work. But if your ego is trying to control them, to fix them, to get them to do it your way, good luck reaching them. Because the part of them that's going to respond to your ego is their ego. And that works real well, as we all know. But I will tell you a true story. There was a teacher from the Punjab region of India who has literally millions of followers. He's a guru over there. And he teaches a particular meditation practice. So most of his disciples are Indians, and they speak either Bengali or Hindi. He also speaks English. Many of them don't. He came on a tour of the United States several years ago. Some friends of mine were disciples of his, and I got to go. I got to go hear it. And the format was he gave a talk, which was in, I'm going to say Hindi. It was Hindi or Bengali, I forgot. But it wasn't English. He gave a talk for 45 minutes. And then after that talk, he gives the same talk in English for the people who don't speak the Indian languages. And then after that, he has a question and answer session. So I'm sitting there listening to this 45-minute talk of his in Hindi. And I have no idea what he said. Except, I start having all these thoughts come into my head. And I start thinking about certain spiritual concepts. And then I start understanding certain things, like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I'm like getting these insights as he's talking about very specific things. But I don't understand a word he's saying. I think I'm just sort of daydreaming until he starts speaking in English. And guess what? That's what I was getting when he was speaking Hindi. So this is a real thing. This is not something from the past or a made-up story. This is a real power of God that is at work in God's communities. And it doesn't really matter whether we go Hindi to English or Greek to Jewish or Hebrew. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the idea that if you allow God to work through you, you can do things you cannot do if you don't allow that. So, going on, there were people there were Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamians, Judeans, Asians, Phrygians, Pamphylians, Egyptians, Libyans, Syrians, Romans, Arabs, Cretans, lots of different nations and lots of different languages, and they all understood the apostles speaking in Aramaic. That's pretty amazing. Now, so the crowd was amazed and with great perplexity began saying things to one another like, what does this mean? And so several of the crowd said, they're just drunk. Which is the reaction you might get in certain circles today if you really speak about God without reservation. Peter then took the stand and raised his voice above the crowd and said, those of you who are of Judea and live in Jerusalem, pay attention to what I'm telling you. None of these people are drunk. It is the third hour of the day. That's 9 o'clock in the morning. This is to demonstrate to you what was promised by our prophet Joel. And now he's quoting the prophet Joel. In the last days, I will pour my spirit out on all mankind. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will have dreams. Even your male and female servants will receive my spirit. Now, females back then, in most Jewish circles, were not allowed to have spiritual authority or teach. This says male and female, even servants. So So there's no hierarchy anymore. I will pour out my Spirit on those days and display wonders to them. And it shall be that everyone who calls upon the Lord will be saved. Not people who believe in Jesus, not Christians. Everyone who calls upon the Lord will be saved. Different story than what I heard growing up. So I want to just say that there's a sequence here. And I want to point out the sequence because great teachers like Moses and Yeshua act out in historic ways so that God can reveal things to humanity in big ways. It's a big story, it's really dramatic, and it's very visible. You can barely not see it. It's so obvious. But then when it applies in our life, my little individual insignificant Stephen life, and your little insignificant whoever you are life, and we think, well, this is nothing. It doesn't play out in those big dramatic fashions, but it plays out in our life just the same, if we pay attention. And if we do pay attention, we can learn from it and cooperate with this process, as opposed to resisting the process. Resisting makes it much harder. So here's the process. First, there's Passover. And that was achieved by Moses listening to the voice of God. If Moses hadn't listened to it and acted on it, there wouldn't have been any Passover. So God was presenting this opportunity, and by Moses listening and saying yes, the opportunity was fulfilled. God will first speak to you, privately, like he did to Moses. Not to a whole community, not to a whole church, you. And you can listen or not. And once you listen, you can then cooperate and say yes or not, because you have free will. And if you don't, the opportunity God is offering in your life is not going to be fulfilled. But if you say yes, it will. And was it with no struggle that Moses accomplished these things? No. Was it with no struggle Yeshua accomplished these things? No. Will it be with no struggle that you accomplish these things? No. Saying yes doesn't mean God's going to make it an easy path. Saying yes means it's going to be fulfilled. So, first of all, we have to listen to that voice and say yes. Second of all, right after that, certain other things happen. Moses says yes, and what happens? You get to go to the promised land and be a free people and worship me the way I want. Yay! Now we're lost and starving in the wilderness for 40 years. Thanks a lot. This is great. And people were saying that, Moses, what'd you do to us? At least we had food in Egypt. You know? So there's a wilderness experience. Years later, Yeshua comes along. He's about to fulfill the ministry he's been given by God. And he goes to his cousin John the Baptist and is baptized in the River Jordan. Jesus sees the Holy Spirit descend from heaven, rest upon him, and stay with him. And he's now ready to start his public ministry. He's at the height of heights. This is great. God is with me. Here we go. Let's start. And what happens? Boom, Satan, 40 days in the wilderness, being challenged and tempted. Ever notice when you start something new? I'm going to the gym tomorrow. I'm starting my diet tomorrow. I'm not going to be so reactive tomorrow. I'm going to pray more tomorrow. I'm going to study more tomorrow. I'm going to attend church every Sunday starting next week. And as soon as you make that commitment, do you know what happens? Something resists that. Well, don't go to the gym today, it's cold. You're going to be tired. You're going to sweat, you have to take a shower. A lot of work. Go tomorrow. Right? That's the same thing playing out. Here's what you've been given to do. You've said yes to it. You're excited. You have the energy and the power to do it. And then everything that can tempt you, frighten you, or distract you from doing it rises right then. Because that's its last chance to stop you. It has to arise right then. And when we let those things overpower what our spirit wants to do, then our life is diminished. And eventually down the road, we say things to ourselves like, I knew better. I wish I would have listened. I knew I should have done that. Don't you? At least I do. So the wilderness experience is something you're going to face. And then what comes is this time of Shavuot. This time after the freedom is given to you, you don't know what to do with it yet. Moses took 40 years to figure it out. Yeshua took 40 days to figure it out. We're given this new spiritual power, this new authority, this new lease on life, this new beginning, this new opportunity, this new service, whatever it is we're given. We're given this new thing. We can get free of our addiction to alcohol, like some of these people have done. We can get free of our addiction to anger, which is another addiction. We can get free of our addiction to self-pity, which is another addiction. We can get free of our addiction to doubting everything. We can get free of our addiction to wanting everything our way all the time. We can get free of things that really trouble us. We can get free of them. And when we're empowered to take that next step, when that's given to us and we have the authority, right then there's a time period of adjusting to that new freedom. What am I going to do with it? When God told the Jews through Moses, you can now worship me any way you want. You don't have to do it the way the Egyptians said. This is your life. Do it however you want. And they were like, woohoo! And then their question was, how do we want to do that? They didn't know. So we have that same thing. There's a discovery process. As you discover more and more deeper layers to who you are as a divine child of God, those layers will be unfamiliar to your mind, and you won't know what to do with it. So you're going to have to grow into that. You're going to have to grow into being a mature child of God. Just like we grow from being a child to an adult, hopefully mature human being. There's a maturation process spiritually too. It takes some time. So that journey is something that we all go through. And so this time, we've now gone from Palm Sunday, we've gone to Easter, we're now in the Shavuot period. And whether you believe this or not, I'm just going to put it out there, whether you believe it or not, Passover's coming up. 50 days after that, something is going to happen in your life. Whether you believe it or not. So I'm just suggesting you pay attention. Because that's the pattern. And 50 days after that, something is going to move inside you that will help you to move closer to the direction you want to go. Whether that's an insight, whether it's an empowerment, whether it's being released from something, whether it's forgiving something, whether it's embracing something, whether it's being able to accept something you've never been able to accept, something's going to shift if you pay attention. Because that's the pattern. That's how it works. And if we pay attention, we can have a much more fulfilling life. So the last thing I want to say is that I should have brought the quote, but I didn't think of it. Charles Fillmore wrote one time that our human anger, our human selfishness, our human greed, our human failures, our human habitual patterns cannot be overcome without the Holy Spirit. And so, in this 50 days that we're about to enter into, we have this opportunity. What they do in that 50 days is introspective work. They take a look inside themselves and go, what's in here that doesn't belong in the temple of God anymore? Money changers were in the physical temple in Jerusalem. And Yeshua said, doesn't belong in a house of prayer. Get out. There are things in me that if you were to walk into my temple, you would say, Stephen, what are you allowing this in here for? Get that out. And some of those things I've gotten out, and I'm so much better because of that. And some of those things, they're still there. And I know they're there. So there are times that we have, and this is one of those times, where it's a propitious time to take a look at ourselves with the self-inventory and go, not in the sense of beating yourself up, but just in the sense of looking. Are there things in you that continue to work against what you want in your life? And if you can identify those things, then start purging them. Whether it's through therapy, whether it's through affirmation, whether it's through prayer, whatever all tools you want to use, start replacing the things that don't work in you with things that do work in you. Start replacing the things that are of the world and all its darkness with the things of spirit and all its light. Start replacing them. Because the truth is, whether we think so or not, what we hold in, what comes into our consciousness, pay attention to this one. What comes into our consciousness is not up to us. We get bombarded with lots of things, including things we never intended to be bombarded with. But what we hold in our consciousness, that's our responsibility. We have power over that. So watch what we hold. So I'm going to just do a short little refrain here and take us into a short meditation.